The cops were halfway up my driveway when everything stopped. The air, the noise, even time itself seemed to hold its breath. 2 squad cars idled at the curb, their lights painting red and blue ghosts across the lawn. The HOA president stood behind them, clutching a binder like it was a weapon, her face twisted in the kind of self-righteous fury you only see in people who've never been told no. And there was my wife, barefoot, in pajama pants, holding a mug of coffee in one hand and her federal badge in the other. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The moment she spoke, you could feel the shift. The officers froze mid-step, and the HOA Karen's confidence cracked like cheap porcelain. That's when I realized this wasn't just another neighborhood argument. This was war. But to understand how we got here, how a quiet cul-de-sac turned into a battlefield, you have to start months earlier. Back when all I wanted was peace, a yard big enough for weekend BBQs, and neighbors who minded their own business. Back before the HOA decided our independence was a threat to their authority. Back before fines started appearing, notes showed up on our door, and someone thought calling the police was a good idea. See, the thing about control is, once someone has a taste of it, they'll do anything to keep it, even if it means crossing lines that should never be crossed, even if it means breaking the law. What started as petty complaints about mailbox colors and lawn lengths became something darker, something personal. It stopped being about rules and started being about power. And in the end, when they tried to push too far, they learned the one thing no HOA manual prepares you for. What happens when you pick a fight with the wrong family? Because the woman they tried to intimidate? The one they thought they could bully into submission. She had the kind of authority that made local cops second-guess their life choices. They wanted control. They got consequences. So the question isn't how far they went. It's how far we had to go to stop them. And trust me, you won't believe what happened next. Cypress Grove Lane looked like something out of a real estate brochure the day we moved in, tree-lined. Streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and the faint hum of sprinklers marking time in the morning sun. The kind of neighborhood where every house looked like it had been, airbrushed into existence, every driveway gleamed, and every mailbox stood at perfect identical angles. From the outside, it was serenity wrapped in suburban perfection. But anyone who's ever lived in a place that perfect knows what that really means. Control. And control always comes with a cost. For Dana and me, that first morning felt like the start of a dream. We'd been saving for years, pouring every spare dollar into the hope of finding a place that felt like ours, truly ours. Not a condo ruled by parking passes, not an apartment with paper-thin walls. A real home, a space we could shape, expand, and to finally breathe in. The property sat slightly apart from the rest of Cypress Grove, a corner lot with more yard than we knew what to do with, bordered by a row of cypress trees that whispered when the wind passed through them. It had an old soul, this place. A bit of unevenness in the bricks, a porch that creaked when you stepped on the third board, a mail slot that jammed if you tried to shove in more than a catalog. But it was ours, and the paperwork was crystal clear. No HOA jurisdiction. I remember that feeling of quiet ownership. Saturday mornings filled with the scent of cedar mulch and slow-cooked ribs. Dana tinkering with her woodworking tools in the garage while I adjusted the smoker's temperature by 0.5 degrees like it was a NASA experiment. We thought we'd found peace, a little pocket of freedom, tucked inside a manicured cage. The neighbors were polite at first, if a little distant. Tom and Marcy from across the street waved whenever we walked the dog. The retirees next door, the Grangers, offered pie one evening and subtle gossip the next. Everyone seemed bound by a shared understanding that civility was the currency of the cul-de-sac. Keep your lawn trimmed, your bins out on the right day, and your business private. That illusion lasted precisely 6 days. On the 7th she arrived. Janet Dreibach. I didn't know her name at first, just the sharp rhythm of her shoes on the sidewalk and the clipboard. She carried like a badge. Her hair was a shade of blonde that only exists in salons, and her smile had the brittle brightness of someone who practices it in the mirror. She was flanked by 2 others, an older man with suspenders and a permanent scowl, and a woman wearing so much perfume the air shimmered. They stopped at our gate like surveyors measuring the border of enemy territory. "Welcome to the neighborhood." she said, thrusting a manila envelope at me before I could even greet her. Inside a stack of documents, forms, and a laminated HOA handbook. I skimmed the front page, confusion prickling at my neck. Cypress Grove Homeowners Association, mandatory participation. When I told her our property wasn't under HOA control, she gave a small, patronizing laugh. "Oh, there's been some confusion," she said. "All properties in the subdivision are subject to the same community standards. It's really just to keep everything consistency. That word would come to haunt me." She left with a cheerful wave, promising to update the records, and for a while, I thought that was the end of it. Dana found the encounter funny. "Let them try to make us match their beige world," she joked. We tossed the packet into a drawer and went on with our lives. But Janet wasn't the kind of woman who took no for an answer. Over the following weeks, I started noticing her more. Always out walking at odd hours, always taking notes. If I left the garage open too long, I'd catch her glancing in. If Dana parked her government SUV out front, I'd see her phone raised just slightly, like she was snapping photos. The first time, I chalked it up to paranoia. The third time, I knew better. The HOA board became a frequent sight. There was Carl, the treasurer, a retired accountant who carried his calculator in a leather holster like it was a weapon. Ruth, the secretary, who had the peculiar habit of whispering everything as though she was narrating a soap opera. And of course, Janet, the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac. Together, they formed what the neighborhood jokingly called the Trinity. At least, those who were brave enough to joke at all. They held meetings every other Thursday in the community center, complete with name tags and printed agendas. Topics ranged from unauthorized lawn ornaments to mailbox color, standardization. You'd think they were governing a small nation, not a handful of middle-class homes. The rules, from what little I saw, bordered on obsession. Grass height within a 1-inch tolerance. Fences must not exceed 4 feet. No exterior paint outside the approved neutral harmony palette. Even the approved bird feeders were listed by brand and SKU. Still, for months, Dana and I stayed out of it. We were busy with work, she in her federal office, me at the plant. We'd wave, we'd smile, and we'd live our lives quietly on our own property. But small things began to shift. A note tucked under the wiper of Dana's car. "Please refrain from parking unmarked vehicles on the street. This is a family neighborhood." A letter in our mailbox addressed to resident of 1 to 12 Cypress Grove. Warning of non-compliant exterior lighting fixtures. And once, a printed HOA fine, $50 for excessive dandelions. The irony? We didn't have a single one. I started keeping a folder for the letters, partly as evidence, partly as grim amusement. Each one was signed by the board, though we all knew whose pen had written the words. The handwriting was unmistakably Janet's, round, looping, and always finished with a flourish that screamed self-importance. It wasn't until spring that things began to feel hostile. Dana had taken a few days off to reorganize the garage, a task she treated with the same focus most people reserve for surgery. Around noon, I heard voices outside, sharp, clipped, and tense. By the time I reached the driveway, Janet was standing there again, this time pointing at the unmarked SUV like she'd uncovered a crime. "This kind of vehicle gives the wrong impression," she was saying. "We can't have suspicious-looking cars sitting in driveways. People talk." Dana didn't respond. She just stared, calm and unreadable, until Janet faltered. Then she turned, walked back inside, and closed the door without a word. That night, a new letter appeared. Unauthorized vehicle presence, potential violation. We laughed it off at first. But laughter started feeling thinner each time. Then came the knock. It was late, a soft, deliberate tap that pulled me from sleep. When I opened the door, no one was there. Just another envelope on the mat. This one wasn't typed. It was handwritten. "You think you're special? Because you're not in the HOA. But everyone plays by the same rules here." That's when I began to see the truth of Cypress Grove. Beneath the manicured lawns and friendly block, parties was a quiet tyranny, a culture of conformity enforced through whispers and paperwork. Janet ruled not with power but with fear. People obeyed because resistance meant inconvenience, isolation, or worse, scrutiny. Tom told me once in hushed tones over the fence that he'd once questioned an HOA fee increase. A week later, he got 6 separate violation notices for fence discoloration and unapproved mailbox dimensions. He paid the fee the next day. By summer, the neighborhood had split itself into 2 kinds of people, those who obeyed and those who endured. We endured. Dana started calling. Janet, the clipboard ghost. She'd appear without warning, always ready to comment on our property, like it was her personal project. You know, she'd say, voice sugar-sweet, the board recommends replacing wooden mailboxes every 5 years. Yours looks seasoned. Or, I noticed your grass is a touch long this week. The standard is 3 inches. Every interaction felt rehearsed, like she'd been waiting for her cue. And every time we responded the same way, polite, detached, unyielding. But inside I was simmering. Not from anger, not yet, but from disbelief. We weren't even under her authority. How could someone pour this much energy into controlling people who didn't even belong to her jurisdiction? It became clear that this wasn't about community standards. It was about territory. Janet needed every house to fall in line, because each compliant homeowner validated her control. We were the outlier, the anomaly, the one reminder that her rules weren't absolute. And people like Janet don't tolerate loose ends. The harassment grew bolder. Fines for imaginary infractions, mysterious complaints filed with the county about unpermitted structures, letters slipped under the door about neighborhood safety concerns. Dana started documenting everything, dates, photos, even video footage from the doorbell camera. She'd handled worse in her line of work, but this was different. This was personal. One morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table with a file labeled Cypress Grove HOA ongoing. Inside were every letter, every incident, neatly organized. She's escalating, Dana said simply. People like this always do. She was right, because a few weeks later, the HOA sent their biggest message yet, an official notice of violation and assessment claiming we owed between $100 in accumulated fines. The letterhead looked legitimate, stamped, watermarked, even notarized. Except for one problem, it wasn't. A quick call to the county clerk confirmed the obvious. Our property wasn't and had never been under HOA control. The notice was fake. That's when Dana contacted her agency's legal department, not as an agent, but as a private citizen seeking advice. She didn't tell them the whole story, just that someone was impersonating an authority they didn't have. Within a week, she had a draft of a cease and desist letter sitting in her inbox, written in crisp, precise legal language that left no room for misinterpretation. We didn't send it yet. We wanted to see how far Janet would go. Turns out, she was just getting started. The next day, a police cruiser slowed in front of our house. Then another. They didn't stop, just lingered long enough to be noticed. Later that evening, Tom came by, pale and fidgeting. He said Janet had been telling people we were under investigation, that Dana was hiding something, that our property was a security concern. That was the moment something in me shifted. The fear gave way to resolve, because here's the thing about bullies, they thrive on silence. They grow stronger when you let them rewrite the rules. But we weren't about to let anyone dictate what we could build, plant or park on land we owned outright. What we didn't know then was that Janet was about to make one final, catastrophic mistake. The kind of mistake that doesn't just backfire, it detonates. And when it did, every carefully painted smile on Cypress Grove Lane would crack. Every neighbor who once whispered, "Just let it go," would learn exactly what happens when you corner people who've got nothing left to lose, and a wife who carries federal credentials. But that part of the story, that's when everything truly began to unravel. It started with the bird feeders. Of all the things to ignite a neighborhood Cold War, I never would have guessed it'd be those little wooden feeders. Dana hung in the oak tree behind our porch. She loved watching the cardinals in the morning, coffee in hand, the sun filtering through the leaves. But to Janet, they were a violation, an affront to community uniformity. Her letter claimed the feeders attracted undesirable wildlife and disrupted neighborhood harmony. Neighborhood harmony. That was her favorite phrase. At first, we laughed it off. We weren't even in her HOA. It was absurd, like being fined by a stranger for breathing too loudly in your own home. But then a few days later, another letter appeared. This one listed the infraction in bold print. along with a $75 fine and a threat of further action if not resolved. I tossed it straight into the shredder. That's when I realized Janet had started keeping track. The next morning I saw her again, standing by the curb, pretending to talk to another neighbor, but really just watching our yard, clipboard in hand. Always the clipboard, her power symbol. Over the following weeks, her crusade escalated from passive-aggressive to obsessive. A letter about our non-neutral mailbox color, another about inconsistent yard edging. Printed photograph of our house, attached to a typed complaint that read, "Structure aesthetics deviate from approved community tone." I didn't even know what that meant. Then came the noise complaint. We were in the backyard on a Saturday, grilling ribs, music barely above conversation level, when a police cruiser rolled up. The officer was polite, embarrassed even. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said, looking past me at the quiet yard and Dana's half-empty glass of iced tea. We both knew who had called. The officer apologized before leaving, muttering something about some folks just don't have enough to do. But I saw the curtains shift across the street. Janet was watching, always watching. It was around then that other neighbors started changing. People who'd once waved now avoided eye contact. Marcy, who had given us zucchini bread our first week, started walking her dog the long way around the block. One morning, I overheard Ruth from the board whispering to a small group near the mailboxes. I caught the words security concern and federal investigation. Dana stayed calm, collected, professional, but I could tell it was getting to her. She'd come home from work quieter than usual. Her patience had limits, even if she didn't show it. People like this, she told me one night, don't stop when you ignore them. They see silence as permission. She was right, because silence only made Janet louder. Soon the letters weren't just tucked discreetly under the door. They were taped in bright neon envelopes, plastered to the gate, sometimes even wedged under the windshield wipers of our cars. Violation, unauthorized. Construction, warning, property, non-compliance, notice. Continued disregard will result in escalation. Each one was more dramatic than the last, the language growing bolder, the fonts bigger, as if sheer typography could make her delusions legitimate. Then came the fines. $200 for aggressively non-neutral paint, $50 for yard clutter, $100 for unauthorized shed planning. That last one stung because we hadn't even built a shed yet. It was just an idea, a blueprint pinned to our fridge. Somehow she'd found out. It was clear now that she wasn't just documenting violations, she was surveilling us. We discovered a small motion-activated camera hidden behind her hydrangeas, angled directly at our property line. When I confronted her about it, she didn't even try to deny it. "Community safety," she said simply, as if that explained everything. You never know who's really living among us. The words had weight, loaded, insinuating. She knew about Dana's job, or at least she thought she did. The next week, she dropped a printed article into our mailbox, something about federal agents living under assumed identities. A not-so-subtle jab. I wanted to confront her, to end it, but Dana stopped me. "Let her dig her own hole," she said. People like her always do. It was easy for her to say. She had patience. I had a temper, and Janet knew exactly how to test it. She started organizing what she called neighborhood watch. Patrols, groups, of residents walking the block at night, flashlights in hand, whispering to each other as they passed our house. Some of them were people we'd shared drinks with a month earlier. Now they barely nodded. The harassment seeped into every corner of our lives. Anonymous complaints to the county about our unpermitted fence, letters from the utility company informing us of community-reported irregularities. Even our mail started arriving opened, like someone had been tampering with it before delivery. Dana's calm started to crack. I'd catch her staring out the window at night, her jaw tight, eyes scanning the street. She started locking the gate every time she came home. "This isn't normal," she said once, barely above a whisper. "This is targeted." She wasn't wrong. One morning I came outside to find our trash cans overturned, contents scattered neatly across the driveway, not dumped, but arranged. On top of the pile, like a signature, was one of Janet's HOA forms. That's when I started documenting everything too. Photos, timestamps, even audio recordings. I bought a second security camera, then a third. The moment I installed them, the complaints doubled. "Unauthorized surveillance equipment," the next letter read. violation of community privacy policy. The absurdity was suffocating. Tom, our neighbor and reluctant HOA treasurer, finally confided one afternoon that the board meetings had turned into witch hunts. "She's obsessed with your house," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder. "Every meeting, it's another motion to bring you into compliance. Even when I tell her your property isn't under our charter, she waves around some old plat map and says the records are wrong. She wants a fight." He told me something else that chilled me. Janet had been digging through county archives, filing inquiries under the HOA's name, trying to find loopholes, old amendments, anything that could link our lot to her jurisdiction. And she'd found something, a technicality, a 30-year-old document referencing a Cypress Grove expansion zone. It was never approved, never recorded, but she claimed it gave her provisional oversight of adjacent lots, ours included. She took that scrap of paper and built an empire out of it. The next HOA meeting was held at her house instead of the community center. Eve, special session, she called it. We weren't invited, but we could hear it from across the street. Raised voices, applause. The next morning, half the neighborhood had compliance first signs staked in their lawns, all matching, all neatly aligned. It looked less like a neighborhood and more like a movement. From that day, everything changed. The harassment wasn't just Janet anymore. It was collective, coordinated, neighbors, stopped by under the guise of friendliness, asking pointed questions, glancing around like inspectors. One of them, a wiry man named Greg, actually took photos of our garage for records. Dana started leaving for work earlier, coming home later. I knew she was reporting things quietly, building a case. She had that quiet efficiency, the same calm she used in high-pressure investigations. But I could see the strain in her eyes, the sleepless nights, the constant state of vigilance. The emotional toll was subtle but corrosive. We stopped hosting friends. We stopped sitting on the porch. Even our laughter felt muted, like the walls were listening. Then, one afternoon in late June, the tension broke. I was in the backyard framing the base for the shed, finally putting that plan into motion. Permits filed, everything up to code. I was covered in sawdust, halfway through cutting a joist when I heard it, the shrill, unmistakable voice of Janet Trybach. "What do you think you're doing?" She stood at the gate, face flushed, clipboard raised like a shield. "You can't build that without approval." "It's not under your authority," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead. Her lips tightened. "Everything in this community is under my authority." She stormed off before I could reply. That night, Dana found a notice taped to our door in red ink. "Cease unauthorized construction immediately. Failure to comply will result in law enforcement intervention." We ignored it. 2 days later, she made good on her threat. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet, humid, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. I was in the backyard again when I heard the sound of engines. 2 patrol cars. For a moment, I thought it was coincidence. But then I saw her, Janet, standing beside them, binder in hand, gesturing toward our yard like she was leading an arrest. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. By the time I reached the driveway, the officers were halfway up. One of them looked uncomfortable, the other wary. Janet was in full performance mode, rattling off phrases like unauthorized structure, safety hazard, and community complaint escalation. That's when Dana stepped outside, pajama pants, coffee mug, and that unmistakable badge in her hand. I'd seen her calm before, professional calm, steady and composed. But this was different. This was authority. The officers froze. Janet's face drained of color. What followed was a silence so thick it seemed to swallow the air. Dana spoke softly, but every word landed like a gavel. "You're trespassing on federal property, and you're interfering with an ongoing project." She didn't elaborate, and she didn't need to. The implication was enough. The officers exchanged a look that said everything. They wanted no part of this. One muttered something about jurisdiction, and within seconds, both were retreating to their cars. Janet was trembling now, the veneer of control cracking for the first time. You can't," she stammered. Dana reached into a folder she'd brought from inside and handed her a single sheet of paper. A cease and desist letter, real, official, and devastatingly clear. Janet's hand shook as she read it. The words "federal statute violation" and personal liability stood out like warnings in neon. By the time she looked up, Dana was already back inside, door closing with quiet finality. But the fallout had only just begun. By evening, word had spread. The neighborhood was buzzing, half disbelief, half delight. For the first time, Janet wasn't the one controlling the story. Rumors swirled. Some said Dana was FBI. Others claimed CIA. Someone even whispered, "Witness protection." Janet didn't show her face for 3 days. When she finally did, she looked like she'd aged a decade. The HOA called an emergency meeting that weekend, this time without her. Tom told us later that the board lawyer had explained in excruciating detail the gravity of her mistake, harassment, false reports, impersonation of authority, all potentially criminal. But Janet wasn't ready to surrender. 2 nights later, a car idled in front of our house for nearly an hour. No headlights, engine humming. When I stepped outside, it sped off. The next morning, our mailbox was bent backward, the screws pulled loose. Inside, a single note, "You don't belong here." It wasn't signed. But it didn't have to be. The message was clear. Janet might have been cornered, but she wasn't finished. That was the moment. I realized we were no longer just defending our home. We were dismantling her empire. And people like her, when stripped of their power, become unpredictable. The tension that had been simmering for months was about to erupt into something much bigger than fake. Fines and angry letters. Because Janet Drybach was done playing by her own rules. And soon, she was going to learn what happens when the rules she twisted finally turned back on her. It happened on a Friday morning. A still, heavy kind of morning, where the air feels charged like something's about to break. For months, the tension on Cypress Grove Lane had been simmering beneath the surface. Every conversation sharpened by whispers, every passing glance heavy with judgment. But that day, it all reached a boil. Janet Drybach was back. She reappeared just after sunrise, marching down the street like she owned it, binder in hand, lips pressed tight, eyes cold with a manic determination. It had been 2 weeks since the police fiasco, 2 weeks since Dana handed her that federal cease and desist letter that sent her entire HOA crumbling into chaos. And yet, here she was, shaken, desperate and clinging to the last shreds of control. By then, everyone knew the story. The rumor mill had worked overtime. Some said Janet had been suspended from the HOA. Others claimed the board was dissolving. But nobody really knew what she'd do next. I found out the hard way. That morning, I was in the yard, cleaning up the debris from a storm the night before, when I saw her coming. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just stormed straight up to the gate like a soldier marching into battle. Behind her trailed 2 men in cheap suits and clipboards, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and regret. "Mr. Teller," she said, her voice sharp and brittle, "these gentlemen are with the County Zoning Commission. I've reported your property for multiple code violations, unauthorized construction, illegal storage, and failure to maintain property standards." Her words hung in the air like smoke. The county inspectors looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am," one said quietly, "we've already reviewed this address. Everything's up to code." Her face tightened. "Then you're not looking hard enough?" I watched as she pushed past them, snapping photos of my shed, the mailbox, even the license plate on Dana's car. She barked questions, demanded documents, accused us of lying about our permits. Her voice grew louder, shriller, until it wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a public spectacle. Neighbors began peeking out from their windows. Curtains fluttered. Tom appeared at the end of his driveway, his face pale with disbelief. "Janet," he called, "you need to stop this." But she didn't hear him. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. She turned on me next, eyes blazing with the kind of fury that comes from humiliation. "You think you're above the rules, don't you? You and your wife, hiding behind your badges and your government nonsense. You've been poisoning this neighborhood since the day you moved in." There it was, the truth, bare and venomous. This wasn't about property. It never had been. It was about pride, control, the need to dominate a world that had long since stopped listening to her. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because at that very moment, Dana stepped out of the house. She was calm, too calm. Dressed in her work blazer, hair tied back, a folder tucked neatly under her arm. There was a precision to her movements, a quiet finality that made everyone watching instinctively take a step back. "Janet," she said evenly, "you've made your point. Now you're going to leave." But Janet only laughed, a brittle, cracking sound that echoed off the houses. "You can't tell me what to do. This is my neighborhood. These are my rules." Dana's eyes didn't waver. She opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers, official looking, documents stamped and signed. "Actually," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "these are the new bylaws, filed by the HOA board last night. You've been permanently removed from your position, effective immediately." A murmur rippled through the watching neighbors. Janet blinked. "You're lying, am I?" Dana handed the top page to one of the county inspectors. "Go ahead, read the signature at the bottom."